Welcome back to the Dershow. When I was growing up, um, the most important committee of Congress was the House Un-American Activities Committee. It destroyed the lives of so many innocent people. It pressured television stations to take people off who were suspected of communism. It was called red channels. There was a blacklist. Witnesses were summoned to the committee and asked about their friends. Privileges that they might have had weren't taken seriously. And of course, we gave a name to this phenomenon. It was called McCarthyism, even though Senator McCarthy was in the upper house, not the lower house. His influence was felt throughout Congress. There was also a Senate committee, but the House Un-American Activities Committee was the more influential and more dangerous and caused more harm. Now, I don't want to make direct comparisons between the House Un-American Activities Committee and the January 9th House committee that is now scheduled to hold televised hearings with a retired TV producer kind of directing it on Thursday night. By the way, the only good thing is the Celtics aren't playing on Thursday night, so I can watch it without avoiding my cheering for my home team. But what's going on with the House Un-American Activities Committee, the new version, really does invoke comparisons. Now, there are differences. The House Un-American Activities Committee was chasing a phantom. I mean, communism was there. It existed in the United States. It certainly was a serious threat all over Europe. The Soviet Union had taken control of all of Eastern Europe, much of Central Europe, part of even Southern Europe, and Cuba, and some other places in South and Central America, like China. And Khrushchev said, "We will bury you." There were real concerns. Stalin was dying and dead, but his successors were threatening. They were a great nuclear power. When we were in elementary school, we had, duck and hide drills. We had to go under our desks as if that would protect us from a nuclear attack. It reminds me a little bit of some of the shooting drills that are going on now. Hide under your desk, keep the door locked. Some of it may help, some of it may not help. In any event, the goals of the January 6th committee are much more positive. I mean, nobody wants to see a recurrence of people going into the Capitol. Nobody wants to see a recurrence of some of the kinds of violence and rhetoric that we saw. And it's perfectly legitimate for Congress to hold reasonable hearings to try to get to the causes of some of the January 6th disruptions. They should also hold hearings as to other disruptions. Obviously, what happened when Black Lives Matters inflicted much greater damage physically, not politically or emotionally, but physically, much greater damage in some Western cities and even some Eastern cities and other radical organizations. I mean, I've been the victim of some of the radical hard left organizations like Antifa. And, the investigations ought to be fair, but Congress has the constitutional power to investigate. What they don't have is the constitutional power to set up a kangaroo court called a committee. I mean, under the rules of the House of Representatives, generally, say if the House is 60-40 Republicans or 60-40 Democrats, then the committees are supposed to be 60-40 or 55-45. The committee membership is supposed to represent the numerical balance in the House, not this committee. This committee is 100% anti-Trump. Most of them are Democrats. There are two what are called Republicans, and they vote Republican on many issues. But when it comes to Trump, they don't vote with the Republicans. They vote with the Democrats. Now, I have no favorable views of what happened on January 6th, as I've said many times. I think the election was perfectly fair. It wasn't perfect. No election ever has been. But Biden is our president, and President Trump should have recognized that, still should recognize that. I didn't like his speech on January 6th, and I didn't like the fact that some people went into the Capitol unauthorized. I don't like the way the police responded to it and the Justice Department responded to it, and keeping people in prison pending their trials. So we can talk about that on another show as well. And I represent one of the people who went in, did no damage, stayed there for a very short period of time, and came out in an effort to protest what he believed was an unfair election. I disagree with him on his belief, but I don't pick my clients based on my beliefs or their beliefs. But the committee is totally rigged and totally one-sided, and no one should believe a word that comes out of the committee reports. The committee reports are going to be a pravda. They're going to be one-sided attempts to create a narrative that supports one side of the story, not the other. It may not be strictly partisan because there are two Republicans on the committee, but it will be strictly ideologically biased in favor of one narrative and against the other narrative. There are constitutional issues as to the composition of the committee. There are statutory and rule issues. Courts have generally ruled against those challenges. And then, as of course I talked about yesterday, there's the issue of the House issuing these illegal subpoenas, which demand that people who are advising the president or have advised the president disclose confidential material. The committee has based its subpoenas on the absurd, really dumb argument that executive privilege invoked by one president can be waived by a subsequent president. That is such a stupid argument. I mean, it's an argument Larry Tribe would make. But it's not a serious, reasonable argument that anybody could in any way take seriously. Only a partisan zealot would argue that President Biden has the power to rescind privileged communications that occurred while somebody else was president. It would just completely eviscerate the privilege. Why would anybody talk to an advisor knowing that the next president could call in the advisor and make him disclose what went on? You know, it would be as if a lawyer, a doctor, a priest, anybody else, once the conversation occurred, you could then say, oh, but we're changing the rules now, and a new psychiatrist has come in or a new priest has come in, and we're not going to have the privilege accepted at this point. It is such a dumb argument. I challenge anybody to write to this show and try to justify that argument. It can't be done. It cannot be done. Only zealots who are talking to themselves in a silo could be making that argument. But that's the argument that the Larry Tribe students who are on the committee and very active in Democratic politics have been making. And nobody should take that argument in any way seriously. So the committee has acted illegally in demanding information, which is privileged, but then they double down and created an even more serious constitutional violation by seeking indictments of people without first going to the courts and saying to the courts, look, here, there's a conflict. The executive says, or said, the former executive says, this is privileged, I won't waive the privilege. The current president says, we waive it for you. Congress says, we don't care about privileges. The defendant says, hey, I can't disclose these things. It's once you disclose it, you can't unring a bell. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. It's disclosed forever. You can't erase things from your mind or from the public record. So clearly everybody in the Justice Department knows that the right approach to this conflict between the executive and legislative branches is to go to the courts and have the courts resolve it at three levels. You have a district court in the District of Columbia, make an initial decision, and if the judge decides that the subpoena is invalid, throw it out. If the judge decides the subpoena is valid and the defendant has to answer those questions, then the judge can direct him to do so. At this point, he has two options. He can comply, three options, really. He can comply or he can appeal, which probably is what they would do to the Court of Appeals. Congress can put it on a fast track and say it's necessary to get the information now, and then up to the United States Supreme Court. Or he could engage in an act of civil disobedience and simply refuse. Now, what Peter Navarro was doing is not an act of civil disobedience. Conceivably, he might engage in an act of civil disobedience, if not him, perhaps somebody else. But right now, it's not an act of civil disobedience because the subpoena is invalid. There's no court order. He's not compelled to respond and answer privileged questions just because Congress says he is. And, it's just what the House Un-American Activities Committee used to do. And Peter Navarro has said, look, I don't have enough money to really challenge this. And he said he's going to be his own lawyer. I'm going to certainly offer him advice. Others will offer him advice. I offer advice to anybody who I think has had their constitutional and other rights violated. I think people should support Peter Navarro. I don't know Peter Navarro. I've spoken to him on the phone, but I don't know him. I probably disagree with almost all of his politics, and he probably disagrees with all of mine, but that's not my job to persuade him as to my libertarian point of view, nor is it his job to persuade me of his conservative point of view. He has the right to have a judicial determination of his claim of privilege before he is compelled to waive the privilege. Not only does he have that right, but former President Trump has that right because it's his privilege. It's as if I confided to my rabbi, and then the rabbi was called. It's not the rabbi's privilege, it's my privilege. I told the rabbi something I don't want anybody to know. I confided in him, or I confided in my doctor, or I confided in my lawyer. I don't want anybody to know that. And I have a right to prevent my professional from disclosing it, just as President Trump has the right to prevent anybody with whom he conferred in the White House about matters of that are covered by the Constitution. Now, a court might hold conceivably that the privilege was waived or there was criminality involved. I'm not suggesting any of these things, but I'm saying a court has authority to void a privilege. For example, if a client talks to a lawyer and they together plan a crime, that's not privileged information. Or if a man threatens his spouse and commits violence on her, the spouse can be called to testify about that. That's not privileged information. But here there's been no determination that the information is not privileged. And so Peter Navarro was doing the right thing. And when's the last time you heard somebody indicted for doing the right thing, for obeying the Constitution, for performing his or her duty to a client or to a president? And yet that's what Peter Navarro has been indicted for, doing the right thing. Would I have done the same thing? Yeah, I might have written a more lawyerly letter, or been a little bit more polite in what I said. I might have written to the committee saying, please indicate all the questions you intend to ask me, and I will tell you which ones I can answer. If the president asks me about the weather, I can answer that. But if he asks me about something that relates to the presidency, no, I can't answer that. As I say, I probably would have written a letter of some kind, but that's not required by the law. Congress simply cannot compel privileged information to be disclosed. I had a case many years ago where Congress tried to do that, and we beat them, the Imelda Marcos case. And I think that Peter Navarro probably will win his case as well. Maybe not at the trial level, but certainly at the appellate level, and I think beyond much doubt at the Supreme Court level if the Supreme Court decides to take the case. But in the meantime, he could be bankrupted. In the meantime, he was just treated horribly. The idea of dragging him off a plane, putting him in handcuffs, putting him in John Hinckley's cell, subjecting him to a body cavity search, he says, and to other humiliation. Generally, in a case like this, you hand the person a summons and say, please appear in front of the magistrate judge tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, and they appear. That's certainly is what happened in every one of my cases. I've never had a client in situations like this treated like a murderer or a robber or a drug-addled violence doer. That's what arrests are supposed to be for. They're not supposed to be for people who are exercising their rights, and he was exercising his right not to respond to questions about privileged information. So I worry about Thursday night. We saw televised hearings before, and we saw how much damage they could do to a person's reputation. If he sits there and publicly invokes privileges, I don't think Peter Navarro will or should do this, but some people will invoke the privilege against self-incrimination, which in the mind of a lot of people says, oh, we're guilty. That's not the case. I've often advised clients not to answer questions that might lead to information, though I never advise my clients to take the fifth itself, because taking the fifth is in the minds of many people, unfortunately, tantamount to a confession of guilt. So I would obviously never myself take the Fifth Amendment, and generally not advise a client to do so. But this is going to be a show on Thursday night. If I read the media correctly, the majority of the committee, which is the whole committee because there really is no minority, has hired a former ABC producer who produced, some dramatic shows to try to make this into a production, into something that people will want to watch, so that they will hear one side of the story. I'm told that Fox is not going to cover it. I think they probably should. But let the American public see the spectacle that's going on and let them respond. It'll be interesting to see how CNN and CNBC and others cover it, whether they will have people who are critical of the hearings as part of the panel, or will everybody be cheerleaders? And probably they'll just be cheerleaders. CNN, of course, never has me on anymore. I used to be a regular guest until I defended the Constitution and President Trump's rights not to be impeached in front of the United States Senate, and until they doctored and distorted what I said in front of the Senate, and I sued them. So I'm no longer available to CNN to tell the truth about what's going on in these hearings. But one would expect that maybe some other stations would have commentators on all sides to be able to go over these issues and analyze them and present a historical context of House committees and the dangers and the benefits. And obviously, there are some benefits. It would be interesting to see a congressional committee dealing with gun regulation, dealing with both sides of that issue, dealing with interpretations of the Second Amendment. Obviously, reasonable people can disagree. For almost 200 years, the United States Supreme Court had one view of the Second Amendment, saying it was not a personal right, it was a collective right of a well-regulated militia. And then in the Heller case, the Supreme Court just switched on a dime and said, no, there is an individual right to bear arms over the dissent of several of the justices. It would be interesting to have congressional hearings on this, and to have both sides of the issue presented, to have some experts present arguments based on empirical information, on studies, on experiences in other countries, as to what kind of regulations could, without interfering with the Second Amendment, perhaps reduce the kind of weekend we had last week, the amount of violence we had in that one weekend, in which there were several mass killings. We've had, I think, 240 mass killings in this country just in this year. But let's go back to the January 6th committee. And so my word is just to remember, when you watch it, there will be an attempt to manipulate you. There will be an attempt to influence you. There will be an attempt to mislead you. There will be a production. There will be professional producers whose job has been for years, selling soap and cars. Now it's selling doctrines and and partisan and views. And I think each of you, when you watch it, should ask yourself, if there were a real Republican, or if there were a Republican who is a defender of President Trump's speech on January 6th, or what happened afterward, if there were a defender there, what would he be asking? What would he be saying? When I do a closing argument to a jury, I tell my students, what you have to do is tell them, look, the government always gets the last word. And while the government is speaking, I want you to imagine, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what I would say if I had an opportunity to rebut him. I want to make you me for purposes of analyzing the arguments in this case. I want you to sit there and say, gee, if Alan had a chance to rebut, what would he say to this argument? What would he say to the argument? Put yourselves in the position of what if there were a balanced presentation on both sides. And I think that's the advice I would give you when you watch the hearings on Thursday night. Ask yourself what I would be asking, what you would be asking, what reasonable Republicans and reasonable defenders of Trump would be saying, and ask yourself those questions, and ask yourself how the members of the committee would be answering. So it's going to be an interesting night on Thursday night. I will probably watch it now that the Celtics are not going to be playing on Thursday night, and I don't know whether the Rangers will be playing or not. But I'm gonna watch the January 6th hearings just to get a sense of how basically unfair it's likely to be. Okay, let's turn now to some letters. This is a pretty extreme one. January 6th is a Democratic Stalin-type witch hunt for their political opposition. Make them pay when we put Republicans in charge of the House of Representatives in November. No, I don't think two rights make a wrong. Two wrongs make a right. No, I think if the Republicans do take over, I hope they will act fairly, but they very well may not. They certainly didn't act fairly in the nomination of Merrick Garland. As I've said yesterday, I'm disappointed in Merrick Garland. I thought he would do a better job in overseeing the Justice Department's prosecution of somebody like Peter Navarro. So I am disappointed and surprised. But the Republicans, if they take over the House, may do similar things. Of course, the difference is the Democrats will still be in control of the Justice Department. So I doubt there'll be any indictments for people who fail to respond to Republican-controlled subpoenas. All right, this letter is a little longer, but it's quite thoughtful. I'm not sure it's unconstitutional. I am positive it's unconscionable. It's yet another instance of our Justice Department and FBI jackboot tactics to intimidate political opponents. I'm certain Navarro would have voluntarily turned himself in had he been asked to do so. I'm sure that's right, without doubt. What threat did he pose? Why did the FBI and Justice Department need to handcuff him in public, put him in leg irons, and tell him he was in Hinckley cell? The answer is simple: to intimidate, publicly shame, and discredit a political opponent of the Democrats. The government used the same tactics against many others in Trump's administration. Stalin and Mao did the same thing to silence dissent. Professor Dershowitz, how can you support a party who would abuse power this way? I don't support the abuse of power. But for me, it's always, what's the alternative? What's the alternative? I personally cannot support a party that doesn't support a woman's right to have an abortion, certainly at the early stages, that doesn't support gay marriage, that doesn't support reasonable gun control, that doesn't support reasonable environmental concerns, separation of church and state. I am a liberal Democrat. I have not abandoned the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has abandoned me, just the way Ronald Reagan said many years ago. I will continue to be a Democrat to try to influence the Democratic Party away from the extremists who now control at least one wing of it, and will continue to vote a Democrat. But there may come a time when I've lost the battle completely and lost all hope, in which case I might switch. That's what happened to many libertarians and liberals in England during the last several years. Oh, one last question. Okay, from my son Elon. Yeah.
The MTA Alex reminds him of this BBC show called Guest Minister, which is very famous in England. And it says, remember, never never call an inquiry unless you know the findings beforehand.
No, that, of course, that's right. That's right. Lawyers are told don't ever ask a question unless you know the answer. I don't accept that. As a lawyer, I have asked questions that I didn't know the answer. And sometimes I've been positively surprised, sometimes negatively surprised. You have to weigh the costs and benefits of asking such a question. But certainly in this case, we know exactly what the results will be, and the hearings are a show trial. And I agree, Dershowitz. Every good Democrat should be up in arms at the way they are treating Peter Navarro, but I haven't seen any good Democrats. Have you? Yeah, I occasionally look in the mirror, and I do see a good Democrat who stands up for the rights of Republicans, maybe even bad Republicans. I'm not saying that about Navarro, but I don't make judgments about people. Hopefully, this will open up your eyes. Democrats are not the Democrats they were 20 years ago. Neither are Republicans. There are some dark forces, at least mass delusion, that makes them work on destruction of this great country. But you can say the same, maybe not to the same degree, but there is an extremist wing of the Republican Party that isn't the same as the Rockefeller Republicans and the Bush Republicans and other Republicans. So I think we're living at a time when we're moving toward extremes on both sides. And I think those of us who are liberal Democrats have a special obligation to confront the extremists on the left. And those of you who are moderate Republicans have an obligation to confront the radicals on the hard right. So let's see if we have time for one more. Does constitutionality matter to the overwhelming majority of lawyers and judges? I can't count, but I think the answer is probably no. I think that for the vast majority of lawyers, certainly, probably judges, though I'm not sure, the Constitution is a tactic for bringing them to the results they want. The worst villain of this, and the person who has taught so many people this kind of result-oriented constitutional analysis, is my former colleague, Professor Lawrence Tribe, who has never come to a constitutional conclusion that I'm aware of that differs from his politics. For him, the Constitution is a way of justifying his ideological and political goals. And he has taught students that for many years. I taught them exactly the opposite, and it's to Harvard's virtue that both of us served on the faculty together, and we're actually friends for a while today. It's become different with the name calling that he's engaged in, and I'm still hoping that maybe he'll return to being able to analyze constitutional issues objectively, neutrally, and passing the shoe on the other foot test. See you tomorrow.